Literature refers to the art of letters, writing ideas down on paper. Most of the literature of the Middle Ages focused on theology, but not all. There were also chronicles. These chronicles detailed the actions of the kings, who ruled when and what did they do. Another favorite of the Middle Ages were chivalric romances, the stories of knights. These knights' tales were often fanciful, and they had spiritual beings that intervened on one side or the other to help knights. Those knights were expected to be Christian knights. They were expected to hold up the Christian values and Christian virtues. And so they were role models for others to follow. So even though these chronicles and romance stories focused on this world, there was always an otherworldly element about God intervening to lift up this king or this family, and God intervening to reward the chivalry of a knight. The Renaissance literature was different. We can see this with Leonardo Bruni, 1370 to 1444. Bruni wrote the history of the Florentine people. This is considered by many to be one of the first modern histories, because Bruni didn't rely on word of mouth. He didn't rely on stories. He went into the archives of Florence and tried to recreate the events based upon a written record. What Bruni produced then was a form of scholarship called civic humanism, that humans should strive to improve their community, that human actions are necessary to make this world better. They weren't necessarily motivated by a spiritual influence. They were motivated by their own desire to improve their life and the world around them. And so Bruni detailed the people in Florence that made Florence a great city. Florence rose in the shadow of Rome. And during the Middle Ages, the Florentine Republic became a rich and prosperous place. And so people can make a difference in their community and in the world around them. To do that, they should engage in politics, political behavior, through discussion, as the Romans did under Cicero in the Roman Senate, where political discussions, political arguments, political rhetoric can bring to light both the problems and the solutions to improve the life of a community. Another Renaissance scholar who focused on politics was Niccolò Machiavelli. Machiavelli wanted to find out how to improve the life of the community. And so he wrote a how-to guide called The Prince. His letter, his document, his book was to advise a prince on how to best to govern. Now, this was not the first type of literature like this. There were many documents in the Middle Ages talking about how a king should rule. They should rule like Jesus. They should be a good king. They should be a good shepherd. Or they should be like Solomon, someone who was wise. Machiavelli put all of those moral questions aside and wanted to find out what worked in this world. And so first and foremost, Machiavelli said, a prince ought to study the art of war. In order to be a good ruler, one must be a good warrior. And to be a warrior doesn't mean running headlong into battle as a lunatic. Rather, a prince ought to study warfare, the history of battles, which tactics were successful, which maneuvers were successful. And a good prince would then replicate that historical behavior and come out on the winning side. The art of war then didn't depend upon the intervention of the gods. Rather, it depended on the ability of the human being to study the art of war and to develop tactics and develop strategies that would actually win on the battlefield. This meant that the prince ought to focus on self-improvement. The prince ought to educate themselves, learn how to read, learn how to write, learn how to study history, learn how to do some basic arithmetic to understand taxes coming in and money going out. And so Machiavelli asked a very simple question. Should a prince focus on liberality or economy? Should a prince spend liberally and freely, or should a king focus on economy, reserve spending? And here Machiavelli talked about the need for balance. They need to spend enough, but they shouldn't be stupid about how they spend. They shouldn't be stingy because they needed to spend on things like the army, walls, roads, bridges. There were things the community needed money to be spent. But they shouldn't focus on their own self-glorification with palaces and thrones. That would be their downfall. So would it better for a king to be feared or loved? Should a king focus on the Christian virtue of being loved? Or should a king be feared? Well, Machiavelli was pretty practical about this. If a people love their king, that's good. But eventually that love is going to fail because people are fickle. People fall in and out of love. Fear, on the other hand, is a better approach for a prince. The people ought to fear the king because fear keeps people in line. Fear makes people understand their place in society. Now, this is not to terrorize a population. That too would be bad. No, this is a solid middle ground in which people need to fear their leaders. If a king tries to be loved, he's going to spend too much money. He's going to seek a love that was going to last and a love that can never last. Therefore, a prince ought to focus on fear. So these qualities then that emerge in Renaissance literature are qualities that are dealing with this world, not the other. It's this world that humans can improve by studying history. Human beings can use their mind to go back and look at the record of the past, analyze those behaviors, and find out what works and what doesn't. Renaissance literature then rebirthed or reintroduced the concept of historical study. Looking at the past, understanding past behavior in terms of human action and human effort, not focusing on the intervention of gods, but what did humans do to make their world a better place? Civic humanism emphasizes that humans have the ability to improve their world if they study the past.